All right, we are the safety team.
Hi guys, my name is Sarah Lido, and the teams that I oversaw for safety were food and beverage, retail, the downtown show, and the suburb flat ride.
I am Kylie Stamey. I oversaw the downtown roller coaster, suburb roller coaster, and nighttime spectacular teams.
My name is Amanda Orndorff, and I oversaw the downtown dark ride, the suburb dark ride, and the suburb funhouse.
Sweet. Okay, so our team's goal was a bit different than the rest of the teams, where they had to start and create new concepts. Our main goal was to take each of these attractions, make them as accessible as possible, safe to operate and experience for the guests, and realistic to operate in everyday conditions. And Kylie can elaborate a bit on the accessibility piece.
Yeah, so currently, according to the ADA guidelines, you have to have a wheelchair transfer space or a wheelchair space in your attraction. But it does not specify like your limb requirements or certain other accessibility features. So with our teams, we really wanted to push them to go above and beyond what they may have typically seen in some of their inspiration. So as you saw in some of our teams, their limb requirements are a lot more loose than we might currently see in today's industry.
So to quickly go over our process as the safety team, during this project, we started with initial research into standards to determine what standards overall were applicable, and then further into which sections of these standards best applied to our specific team's park attractions. And we then compiled those standards and handed them off to the teams to use as a reference. And then we continued to act as safety managers to the teams for the rest of the project to do things like answer questions as they arise, help point teams in the right direction, and assist as needed.
Sweet. So now we're going to go attraction by attraction and cover some basics of what was the safety that we did for that particular team. So if you weren't here for the Mechatron's flat ride presentation, I can give you a quick synopsis. This is the ride where guests get to go inside the first ever spaceship that appeared at Gate. Next slide. Okay, so our main safety standards we use with the flat ride were ASTM, ADA, and Florida Building Code. For the teams that I oversaw, this was actually, they had the most safety standards because of its multiple levels, as you can see in the elevation map. And the ride system is very old. The ride system they used was a rotor or a gravitron, which was created in 1949 and it first debuted at a World's Fair type event in 1951. So it literally was so old that it existed before safety standards actually were applied to it. So we, after further research into the history of the ride system, we decided that at the end of the day, we needed to claim this a service proven ride by comparing it to rotor systems and rides that had this system that were safe and were didn't have any problems. One of the other things that we realized with this ride is a lot of rotors don't have any restraints or seat belts. Also, this ride in our attraction does not have any restraints. So we confirmed with ASTM's F2291, and we are a class A1 for this ride, so we do not require restraints. And sadly, due to the lack of restraints on this ride and the floor lowering when the ride system starts spinning, this ride in particular is actually not ADA compliant. However, the building itself is by utilizing ramps when changes in levels occur. It is in fact the only ride in our park that is not accessible in some way, but that is okay because the overall park's percentage of accessibility is to par.
Okay, so I worked with the suburb roller coaster, which for those of you who forgot is the Stargrove Labs Snake Route Escape. This is one of the most high intense rides in the park. So they made a really great safety sign, and I wanted to make sure this was highlighted. They really went above and beyond in creating that. As you can see, they chose a 48-inch height requirement. They put in the details about having recent surgery or high blood pressure, as well as you can see the limb requirements on the right side. So what they have there is you need 3 limbs or a supplemental restraint as well as wheelchair transfer would be required. This is an example of the restraint they would be using to supplement those with missing limbs. So on the right, you can see an example of it on a person. It's very similar to a climbing harness, and it would attach to the back of the seat. And this would be the first time that this has been added to the RMC system they chose. So they really went above and beyond to push the current limb requirements for that ride. In addition, they also have a fully accessible queue from start to finish, so ADA guests get the same experience. They also looked into technical compliance with ASTM F2291. As you can see on the left, in their simulation, they added a reach envelope bubble that met the most current standards within F2291, and they checked that throughout the entire ride. As some of you may have seen, there are areas where it gets very close, and you even have an area where it's dueling with one farther in the ride. But throughout all of it, the reach envelope is, completely correct. They also looked at the accelerations of the ride. As you can see, there's an example of one of the eggs that is in 2291. And they compared all that to make sure they stay within acceleration limits throughout the ride. And additionally, they looked into having handrails of correct dimensions, that their ramps met all the grade limits, and that proper class 5 restraints would be used on their ride. Oh, this is also mine. I also worked with the downtown roller coaster team. This was the one where you were test driving a car and taking your driving test. They also did a really great job with accessibility. Their ride vehicle, as you can see, is the correct height for wheelchair transfer. And they really looked into it and noticed that a lot of vehicles were too low for super easy transfer. So they tried to make it right on height with a typical wheelchair and not have it be a super special seat that needs a transfer device, but instead just be something that flips over and you can easily transfer. They also have real-time captioning of onboard audio, which really adds a lot for people who may be hard of hearing, or personally, I'm just bad at listening. And so that's a really great feature to have and something that they really incorporated into the ride well. They also have an accessible queue. So they do utilize a virtual queue sign-up system, but there is a short queue portion you will go in once it is your time to go. And unfortunately, that is not accessible, but they made an alternate route that includes themed elevators, which would give a similar experience to the guests who be walking through the standard queue. So that is something that is not seen a lot, and I think they did a great job with working with. A lot of times it's just a plain standard elevator and you miss so much of that story buildup that occurs in the queue. But they really worked hard to incorporate that, as well as having a special private platform area so you're not having to fight and compete with other guests as you try to load with someone who may need more time or assistance. As well, you can see the reach envelope from 2291 overlaid on their vehicle. So you can see that they considered it and they looked at the measurements they would need to have the clearance all around their ride.
So next we have the Suburb Dark Ride, which is the Zimbly's ARV adventure. And this was the attraction where the family is going on their normal family vacation. And so this attraction took ASTM, ADA, and Florida Building Code into consideration, and specifically these were applied to their queue and ride vehicle. The queue for this attraction is a virtual queue with an open floor plan where guests are able to roam the space freely with elements such as lawn games. And it was designed with building code in mind, with being given the proper occupancy classification and the proper number of exits to safely exit guests in case of an emergency. And the space also took into account surfaces to be both ASTM and ADA compliant. For example, the turf simulating the lawn area uses ADA compliant turf, which is stable, firm, and slip resistant. This dark ride was also using an existing ride vehicle, the Oceaneering Revolution, which is where they pulled most rider requirements, so such as like height, limb requirements, and clearance envelope. And the current ride vehicle that they were using uses a lateral transfer for guests. And as a goal, we talked about making the ride as accessible as possible, just like a lot of the other attractions. So the dark ride team did amazing and went beyond that and created their own accessible vehicle with a wheelchair space and companion seat that is compliant with ADA standards, which is great because that'll just allow more people to be able to ride the ride. And ASTM compliance was also discussed. And ASTM F2291 was considered specifically for the restraints. A class 2 restraint was used as seen circled here due to acceleration limits, as well as other considerations by the team. So next we have Cosmic Countdown, which is the downtown dark ride. And the main consideration was the queue layout for this team and making sure it was designed to be accessible, and that was something that they wanted to focus on. So based off some standards that I compiled for them, the team designed an area which is ADA compliant, as well as contains the proper emergency exit. So then we have the Suburb Funhouse, which is 18 Bradbury Lane, Glenforbes Escape. So as this is a timed walkthrough attraction with no ride components, some things like ASTM were not taken into consideration. So the main focus for this attraction was on ADA and Florida Building Code compliance. So one of the biggest concerns with this team was being able to safely evacuate guests from the building in the event of an emergency. We didn't want guests to have to get further into the attraction or continue traveling through themed areas where they're getting a perception altering experience. And so a solution that was implemented was a specific emergency exit hallway only used for this purpose, as you can see here highlighted in yellow. Other discussions that happened were guest requirements for those who should experience this attraction. Again, this attraction is on the more accessible side as there are no moving vehicles or transfers that would need to happen. So with no restrictions on factors like height, more broad conversations occurred with this team. As far as mobility devices go, the entire attraction is ADA compliant for things like turning space, pathways, and doorways, to name a few. So guests using wheelchairs may enjoy the walkthrough in its entirety. An extra space was also considered to accommodate most larger electric wheelchairs and mobility devices. It was also determined that service animals will be permitted throughout the attraction without the need for using kennels. And in order to provide resources for guests to choose if this experience is right for them, a sensory guide was created for those who would find this information helpful. And then finally, additional services such as audio description devices will be available for those who need them. And to expand on this sensory guide, it follows the IBCCES format, which many themed entertainment venues are currently using or adopting when becoming certified autism centers. And using these already approved guides from other theme parks, this was applied to this attraction, and the 5 senses were given a rating on a scale of 1 to 10, as you can see here. The room elements were taken into account and what elements of surprise they would bring. So certain things that could potentially raise an issue for people, such as mist and bubble effects that are used in the attraction, unexpected loud noises of things being destroyed, and bright colors and very sudden movements, as well as proximity to other guests. This way, it's just a guide for people to be able to choose if this attraction is right for them. And I think that this is like a great step that some theme parks are moving towards taking. And so we wanted to implement it on this attraction.
And next is our downtown show, which named Protoflight, which is our interactive character-driven walkthrough show experience. So similar to the Maze Funhouse, this is not a ride, this is a walkthrough show. So ASTM was not considered with this. The main standards were ADA and Florida's building code. Protoflight has a throughput of 1,000 guests per hour, split between 3 alternating show buildings. Our biggest challenge for this attraction was to figure out how to evacuate 1,000 guests at one time without having them run into each other, or move further throughout the attraction, or go further into themed portions of the ride or the show. That way they get confused. So we wanted them to evacuate quickly and safely immediately from where they currently were outside. So we came up with this safety evacuation plan and these evacuation rules. We can go to the next slide. So first rule of operation are rooms B and their respective waiting areas for A, F, and G will never host guests at the same time. Next slide. Rooms A, F, and G will accept the next group of guests at the earliest when the show sequence in room C has started. And thirdly, rooms B will accept the next group of guests when the show sequence in C and D, the flight sequence, has ended at the end of their show. And lastly, the 3 alternating showrooms shall be alternated such that the exit hallway will only support 1 full room of Group E guests.
Okay, so the final team I worked with was the Nighttime Spectacular, the Gate Showcase. But before I got into that, in case some of you don't come from a technical background or aren't American, I kind of just wanted to explain the standards we've been mentioning. So ADA is the American with Disability Act and sets standards for how accessible buildings and attractions and everything else in the United States must be. And ASTM is an international standards association, and F2291 that we've been mentioning sets standards and guidelines for the design of amusement rides and devices. So that is what we've been mentioning. So first there was fireworks in the Nighttime Spectacular show, and they followed primarily the guideline from 1123 from the NFPA, which had the codes for the firework displays. So they took into consideration what size mortars they were going to use, and they chose 10-inch mortars as their maximum, and that has a secure 1,400-foot diameter as seen in the blue circle, with the launch site being the white circle. As you can see, there are some buildings and areas within that blue circle. Those areas would be appropriately evacuated as needed during the show, as well as the tops of buildings would be hosed down if needed to prevent any issues with debris. And as you can see, the viewing area is in orange near the bottom, well outside of that secured diameter. They also considered drone safety, looking to a lot of the Federal Aviation Association standards. As you can see on the left was a little bit of concept art about a drone fleet. They would be using 200 drones. And as we shortly realized, there's not really a lot of guidelines on commercial use of drones like this, where you have a huge fleet. There are a lot of guidelines for personally operating, such as how to be licensed as a drone operator. And there are waivers you have to apply for fleet operation over people. But in terms of using it as a show element, there was not a ton out there. So they really looked into the FAA standards as much as they could and used those. And then they also went above and beyond and looked into existing shows and other companies that have used this that are proven to be safe, as well as large companies who definitely put a lot of consideration into this for their crowds. So a couple of things to note is that licensed drone operators will be on standby for manual override if needed, as well as in this map, you can see that purple rectangle towards the top would be the launch zone. Again, with the orange rim on the bottom being the viewing area. And then water safety. So guest barges in red will be equipped with the appropriate number of life vests for the number of patrons on board. All the performers on the barges, which are the pink squares, will have swim tests administered before employment, very similar to lifeguards or other water shows at theme parks, as well as lifeboats and jet skis will be stationed on the water for guests and performers in case of emergency.
And to go over this last attraction very quickly, this is one of our retail attractions called Georgie's. So an original blue sky concept for Georgie's, the employees were going to be on roller skates similar to a 50s style diner. It was very immersive, creative, authentic idea, very fun idea. Sadly, we realized it wasn't going to work in the day-to-day. We had to consider employee safety, guest safety, finances, and maintenance. For employee safety, like what happens when an employee eventually runs into a display or a shelf? What if merchandise falls on the floor? What if they trip and fall? It's a very big hazard for someone on wheels. Our solution became we were going to bolt all the displays to the floor and keep all necessary merchandise on the walls. Then we had to continue the conversation and consider guest safety. What happens when an employee eventually runs into someone or trips over a small child? Unlike a 50s style diner, your guests are constrained to the booths and the tables. They're not running around and looking at things and not paying attention to where they're going. So the solution that we seemed to discuss was a sort of bike lane or a skate lane inside the store. Started to seem a bit impractical, however. Once we got into finances and maintenance, that's when we really kind of discovered this wasn't sadly going to be up to par. For finances, we can't train someone to stand on skates for that long. So we'd have to hire out performers, which means they're going to work like performers. They're getting paid more and working less hours. That also means they can only be on skates for so long, so we're paying them for hours that they're not working. And maintenance-wise, who fixes the skates? That's another person we have to put in our budget. Where do we fix the skates? Where are we storing the skates? How often are we maintaining or replacing skates? How much does it take to replace skates? So our final conclusion at the end of it became this was a beautiful blue sky concept, but in operations day to day, we decided our employees will no longer be on skates for Georgie's. And we'd like to say thank you to these people for wonderful management and mentorship and answering any necessary questions that we had. Thank you, guys.